her puppies offering them what little warmth he could. The mother dog let out a soft sigh, her body finally relaxing as the heat of the cabin began to seep into her frozen bones. The tiny pups nestled against her, their shivering bodies slowly calming as they soaked in the newfound comfort. Jack knelt beside them, his heart still pounding from the intensity of the moment. He could see the exhaustion in the mother's eyes, the battle she had fought against the storm to keep her pups alive. How long had they been out there? How much had they endured? "You've been through hell, haven't you?" Jack murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. He reached out slowly, his hand hovering just above the mother's head, giving her a moment to decide if she would accept his touch. She flinched at first, but then, as if realizing she was finally safe, she nudged her head into his palm. A lump formed in Jack's throat. He had seen bravery before, on the front lines of burning buildings, in the eyes of his fellow firefighters, but this was a different kind of courage, a mother's relentless will to protect her children, even in the face of death itself. He stroked her gently, his fingers running through her ice-matted fur. "You're safe now," he assured her. "You're not alone anymore." The fire crackled softly beside them, casting a golden glow over the small, unexpected family. Jack didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but one thing was certain. His life had changed in that moment. And maybe, just maybe, these three fragile souls had saved him just as much as he had saved them. They weren't going back out into that storm. Not now, not ever. Jack exhaled, his breath steadying as he leaned back in his chair. The fire's glow flickered across the room, casting a warm golden light over the unexpected family curled up by the hearth. The mother dog's chest rose and fell in slow, deep breaths, exhaustion finally winning over her weariness. One of the tiny pups let out a soft squeak in its sleep, pressing closer to its mother's warmth. Jack ran a hand through his graying hair, his mind still trying to catch up with everything that had happened in the last hour. He had been prepared to ride out the storm alone, isolated in the silence of his cabin. But fate had other plans. He glanced at the German shepherd, at the quiet trust slowly building between them, and he felt it again. That pull in his chest, a purpose he hadn't felt in years. "You're safe now," he murmured, his voice barely above the crackling of the fire. "We all are." As the night stretched on and the blizzard howled outside, Jack stayed awake just a little longer, watching over the small family that had found their way to his door. He didn't know what came next, but one thing was certain. He wasn't alone anymore. Her pups onto the blanket. Jack moved carefully, making sure not to startle her. She tensed at first, her muscles rigid with distrust, but when she saw that he was gentle, that he wasn't going to take her babies from her, she allowed him to proceed. "That's it, girl," Jack murmured, wrapping the edges of the blanket around her to keep her and the pups warm. "We're just going to take a little trip, and then we'll get you back home." The journey to the vet was slow and careful. Jack drove with one hand steady on the wheel, and the other occasionally glancing towards the passenger seat, where the German shepherd lay curled up, her pups nestled safely against her belly. Her eyes flickered open now and then, watching him with weary trust. When they arrived at the clinic, a vet tech was already waiting outside with a stretcher. Jack climbed out of the truck and moved to help, but as soon as the tech approached, the mother let out a low growl, pressing her body protectively over her pups. "Easy, girl," Jack soothed, placing a reassuring hand on her side. These people are here to help, I promise." The vet, a kind-faced woman in her 40s, crouched down, giving the dog space. "She's been through a lot," she said softly, her eyes scanning the shepherd's frail form. "But she's got a strong spirit. We'll do everything we can for her and the pups." Jack nodded, feeling an unexpected wave of emotion swell in his chest. He had found them in the middle of a deadly storm, half frozen and desperate. Now he was standing here, watching as strangers stepped up to help them, to give them a chance at something better. "Thank you," he said, his voice quieter than he intended. The vet offered him a reassuring smile. "Go grab a coffee or something, Mr. Carter. We'll take good care of them." Jack hesitated for a moment before nodding. As he stepped back, he saw the German shepherd's amber eyes flicker up to meet his, just for a moment. It was fleeting. But in that instant something passed between them, an unspoken understanding, a bond that had formed in the heart of a snowstorm. Jack didn't know what the future held for this brave mother and her pups, but one thing was certain. He wasn't walking away. Eventually, those sighs turned into quiet contentment. Jack had never considered himself the type to believe in fate, but something about Grace's arrival felt meant to be. He had spent so many years running into burning buildings, saving lives, yet in retirement he had felt adrift, uncertain of what came next. Now, with Grace and her pups curled up by his side, he felt something settle inside him, a quiet understanding that sometimes the ones we save end up saving us too. As the days turned into weeks, Grace's transformation was undeniable. Her ribs were no longer as visible, her coat had regained its sheen, and her eyes, once filled with fear and exhaustion, now held warmth and trust. Snow and Ash grew stronger, their playful yips filling the once silent cabin with life. They stumbled around on wobbly legs, exploring every corner of their new home, under their mother's watchful eye. One evening, as the fire crackled and snow fell gently outside, Grace did something that caught Jack off guard. She stood, stretched, and then walked over to him. Without hesitation, she laid her head in his lap, letting out a long, slow breath. Jack swallowed hard, his fingers running through her soft fur. He had always been a dog lover, but this was different. This wasn't just about taking in a stray. This was about healing, about finding family in the most unexpected places. "You're home now," he whispered, his voice steady with conviction. "All of you." And as Grace drifted into a peaceful sleep, her pups curled beside her, Jack knew, without a doubt, that none of them would ever have to face another storm alone. Eventually, she even let him touch her without flinching. One stormy night, as the wind howled outside, Jack sat on the floor, his back against the couch, watching the flames flicker in the hearth. Grace lay nearby, her head resting on her paws, while Snow and Ash clumsily tumbled over each other, their tiny tails wagging with innocent joy. Jack couldn't help but smile at their playful antics. "You've got some tough little ones there, Grace," he murmured, glancing at her. Grace lifted her head, her amber eyes locking onto his. There was something in her gaze, something Jack could only describe as gratitude. Slowly he reached out, his hand brushing against her head. To his surprise, she didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into his touch, her body finally relaxing, as if she had found a place where she no longer needed to be afraid. As the days passed, Grace's transformation was undeniable. Her once matted fur regained its luster, her frail body grew stronger, and her once empty eyes began to shine with life. She played with her pups, nudging them gently with her nose, watching as they stumbled and yipped around the cabin. Jack, too, found himself changing. For years he had lived alone, content with the quiet solitude of his retirement. But Grace and her pups had brought something into his life that he hadn't even realized he was missing: purpose. The once silent evenings were now filled with the soft padding of paws against the wooden floor and the playful barks of new life. One crisp afternoon, as Jack chopped firewood outside, he noticed Grace standing by the window, her nose pressed against the glass. Snow and Ash played at her feet, their tiny bodies tumbling over each other. Jack wiped the sweat from his brow and waved at her. To his amazement, Grace wagged her tail, just once, but it was enough to make his heart swell. When he stepped inside, she greeted him at the door, her tail wagging slightly as she nudged his hand with her nose. It was the first time she had approached him willingly. Jack couldn't stop the grin spreading across his face. "Well, aren't you full of surprises today?" He chuckled, kneeling to scratch behind her ears. Grace leaned into him, her tail wagging even more enthusiastically now. Snow and Ash barked happily, circling around his legs in excitement. Their bond had grown stronger, yet Jack still wondered about Grace's past. Where had she come from? What had led her to his doorstep that snowy night? The questions lingered in his mind, but one thing was certain. Whatever her story was, it was one of survival and resilience. She had faced the worst of circumstances, yet she had fought through them, never giving up on her pups. That night, as they all settled by the fire, Jack looked at Grace and spoke softly. "I don't know where you came from, girl, but I'm glad you found me. You and these little ones. You're part of the family now." Grace lifted her head, her amber eyes meeting his. In that moment, there was an unspoken understanding between them, a bond that needed no words. With a quiet sigh, she rested her head on his lap, her body completely at ease, for the first time since she had arrived. Jack swallowed hard, stroking her fur. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected a stray dog and her pups to change his life. And yet, as he sat there in the warmth of the fire, surrounded by the quiet sounds of their peaceful breathing, he knew one thing for certain. He had saved them. But in a way, they had saved him too. The morning sun filtered through the cabin windows, casting golden beams across the wooden floor where Snow and Ash tumbled over one another, their tiny barks filling the air with warmth. Nearby, Grace rested, her eyes half closed, but her ears flicked at every small sound, ever alert. Jack stood by the kitchen counter, a steaming mug of coffee in his hands, watching them with a quiet contentment he hadn't felt in years. This cabin had always been a place of solitude, a retreat from the world. But now it was filled with something else: life. Yet, despite the newfound peace, a question gnawed at him, a question he couldn't ignore. Where had Grace come from? She bore the marks of a hard life, the faint scars along her coat, the way her ribs had once shown through her thin frame, the cautious way she flinched at sudden noises. Someone had failed her. Someone had let her suffer, and whoever they were. Jack had a sinking feeling they might still be out there. That afternoon, Jack decided to take Grace and the pups outside. The heavy snow had begun to melt, revealing patches of frozen ground. As he stepped onto the porch, Grace hesitated, her nose lifting to the air as if testing it for danger. The pups, blissfully unaware of the world's dangers, yipped in excitement, their tiny paws clumsily pattering over the cold earth. Jack smiled, watching them. "You're safe now, girl," he murmured. "Nothing's going to hurt you here." But then Grace froze. Her ears shot up. Her muscles tensed. Her eyes locked onto the distant tree line. Jack followed her gaze, his own body stiffening. "What is it?" he asked, stepping closer. Grace let out a low growl, her hackles rising. Her stance was no longer cautious. It was defensive. Protective. Jack squinted into the trees. He saw nothing. No movement, no sound. Just the endless stretch of darkened trunks and tangled underbrush. But he knew better than to dismiss Grace's instincts. Something or someone was out there. Heart pounding, he scooped up the pups, cradling them in his arms as he guided Grace back toward the cabin. Once inside, he locked the door and pulled the curtains shut. Grace continued to pace near the window, her eyes darting toward the woods. Even after the sun had set, the unease clung to Jack like a shadow. That night, as he sat by the fire, watching the flames flicker and dance, he couldn't shake the feeling that their safety had been an illusion. Grace lay nearby, her pups nestled against her warm body, but she remained restless. Jack reached out, running a hand gently over her head. "You're not just being paranoid, are you?" he murmured. "You've seen something like this before." A lump tightened in his throat. Had she been hunted, chased, hurt? Jack clenched his fists at the thought. Whoever had done this to her, whoever had abandoned her, left her to suffer in the freezing cold, had no right to call themselves human. And if they were still out there, he would find out. The next morning, Jack made a decision. He loaded Grace and the pups into his truck and drove into town. He needed answers. The local animal shelter was small but well run, staffed by volunteers who had spent years rescuing animals and reuniting lost pets with their owners. If anyone knew where Grace had come from, it would be them. As Jack stepped inside, the scent of clean hay and pet shampoo filled the air. The soft murmur of voices and the occasional bark echoed through the space. He approached the front desk, pulling out his phone. On the screen was a picture he had taken the night before. Grace, sitting by the fire, her golden brown eyes reflecting something deep, something haunted. Jack took a deep breath. "Do you recognize this dog?" he asked. The woman at the desk glanced at the photo, and then she froze. Her expression shifted from polite curiosity to something else entirely, something that made Jack's stomach drop. She knew something, and Jack was about to find out exactly what. Jack placed the worn photograph on the shelter's counter, his voice steady but filled with quiet urgency. "I found her outside my cabin," he explained. "I was hoping you might recognize her. Maybe someone's reported her missing." The receptionist, a kind-looking woman in her 40s named Sarah, studied the image for a long moment. Her brows furrowed, her lips pressing into a thin line. Then, with a quiet sigh, she shook her head. "I don't recognize her," she admitted, "but dogs like her, we see them more often than we'd like." Jack's stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" Sarah hesitated, then met his gaze with a sadness that sent a chill through him. "A lot of breeders out here keep dogs in horrible conditions. Once they're no longer useful, too old, too weak, too injured, they just dump them." Jack felt his fingers tighten into fists. "You mean to tell me she was thrown away?" Sarah nodded solemnly. "It happens more than you'd think. But she's lucky she found you." Lucky. Jack swallowed hard, his jaw clenched as he thought of Grace. How thin she had been. How afraid. How she had pressed herself against the cold, unwelcoming night until he let her in. She wasn't trash. She wasn't disposable. She mattered. To her pups. To him. And now Jack was more determined than ever to make sure she never felt unwanted again. The drive home was heavy with silence. Jack kept glancing at Grace through the rear-view mirror. She sat calmly in the truck bed, her eyes watching the road, as if she could sense that something had changed. When they finally arrived, Grace stepped out first, sniffing the crisp evening air. Her tail wagged, just slightly, but it was enough. Snow and Ash stumbled after her, their tiny legs working hard to keep up. Jack watched them, his heart swelling with a mix of anger and something else, something stronger. "You're safe now," he said softly, but with firm conviction. "No one's ever going to hurt you again." Grace turned to him, her amber eyes locking onto his. And in that moment, he knew. She understood. She believed him. And Jack made a silent vow. Whoever had abandoned her, whoever had cast her aside, would never get the chance to hurt her again. The days passed in a quiet, uneasy calm. Grace seemed to settle more and more, her trust in Jack growing stronger. Snow and Ash had turned the once silent cabin into a playground of endless exploration. Their playful barks and tumbling paws filled the space with a warmth Jack hadn't realized he'd been missing. And yet, Jack couldn't shake the feeling, that crawling sensation at the back of his mind, the way his skin prickled when he stepped outside at night, as if someone was watching them. And then, one evening, he knew for sure. Jack was sitting by the window, his hand absently stroking Grace's fur as Snow and Ash dozed near the fireplace. Outside, the moonlight spilled across the snow-covered yard, casting long shadows that stretched like reaching fingers. The trees stood tall and silent, their bare branches swaying ever so slightly in the cold wind. Then, his breath caught in his throat. A figure, standing at the edge of the woods. Jack leaned closer, his pulse hammering, his eyes strained against the darkness, trying to make out the shape. It was tall, unmoving, cloaked in shadow, but undeniably human. They weren't walking, weren't moving toward the cabin, just watching. Jack's fingers curled around the curtain's edge, his heart thudding like a distant drum. "Grace," he whispered. The German shepherd's ears shot up. She followed his gaze out the window. The second her eyes locked onto the figure, her entire body tensed. And then, a deep guttural growl rumbled from her throat, a sound Jack had never heard from her before, primal, protective. Snow and Ash stirred, their tiny bodies instinctively pressing closer to their mother. Jack's stomach turned to ice. This wasn't a passing stranger. Whoever they were, they had been waiting, watching. And now they knew that Jack had Grace. He yanked the curtains shut, and for the first time since finding Grace on that snowy night, Jack felt afraid. Jack's fingers trembled as he grabbed his phone, his pulse hammering in his ears. He dialed. The line rang once, twice. Then, "Sheriff's Department, what's your emergency?" Jack forced his voice to stay steady. "This is Jack Carter," he said, gripping the phone tighter. "There's someone outside my cabin. I don't know who they are, but they've been standing at the edge of the woods for a while now, just watching." The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional. "Stay inside and lock your doors. I'm sending a deputy now." Jack swallowed hard and nodded, even though they couldn't see him. "Thank you." But something about this felt wrong, too deliberate, too personal. Minutes stretched into eternity. The only sounds were the crackling fire and Grace's low, steady growl as she stood by the door. Every now and then, her ears twitched toward the window, her muscles coiled, ready to spring into action. Jack paced. He tried to tell himself it was nothing. Maybe just some lost hiker. Maybe just a harmless drifter. But deep down, he knew better. Then, headlights cut through the night. Jack exhaled, tension loosening just a fraction, as a patrol car rolled into the driveway. The door opened, and Deputy Miller, a tall, no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes, stepped out. Jack met her at the door, wasting no time explaining what he had seen. "It wasn't just some random passerby," he said firmly. "They were watching us, watching Grace." Miller's expression darkened. Her hand instinctively rested on the holster of her flashlight. "I'll take a look around," she said. "Stay inside. Keep your doors locked." Jack nodded, his gut twisting as he watched her disappear into the woods, the beam of her flashlight slicing through the darkness. He stood by the window, fists clenched, his breath shallow. Grace didn't move from the door, her body rigid, her growl still humming low in her throat. Then Miller emerged. Jack met her outside, searching her face for answers. Her expression was grim. "There's no one there now," she said. "But I found tracks. Fresh ones. Whoever it was. They were standing there for a long time. Watching." Jack felt a chill crawl up his spine. "Did you find anything else?" Miller hesitated. "There was a piece of rope tied to a tree," she admitted. "It's old, but it looked like it had been used recently. My guess. Someone's been camping out there." Jack's stomach turned to ice. Camping. Or waiting. "Do you think they'll come back?" Miller exhaled, her eyes scanning the tree line. "I can't say for sure," she admitted. "But I'll have patrols pass through this area more frequently. If you see anything else, anything, call us immediately." Jack nodded, but his gut told him one thing. This wasn't over. The cabin felt different after Miller left. He locked every door, checked every window, twice. Something about this wasn't random. Whoever had been out there wasn't just passing through. They had been watching Grace. Why? Jack sat in his armchair, his mind racing with questions he didn't have answers to. Grace approached him slowly, pressing her head against his knee. He reached down, running his fingers through her thick fur. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Don't worry, girl," he murmured. "I won't let anyone hurt you, or those pups." Grace let out a soft whine. And then Jack saw something in her eyes. Fear, but not just fear. Recognition. His pulse quickened. She knew something. Something about the person in the woods, and whatever it was. It terrified her. That night, Jack didn't sleep. He sat by the window, his rifle within arm's reach, his gaze locked on the tree line. Grace lay at his feet, her body tense, her ears twitching at every small sound. Snow and Ash slept soundly by the fire, their tiny bodies rising and falling with each peaceful breath, blissfully unaware of the danger lurking beyond the trees. Jack made a silent vow. No matter what, no matter who, came for them. He would protect Grace and her pups at any cost. They were his family now, and he wasn't about to let anyone take them away. The first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the curtains, casting a faint glow over the wooden floor. Jack had barely closed his eyes. He poured himself a fresh cup of coffee, his thoughts still tangled in the events of the night before. And then, a sound, a low warning growl. Jack froze. His hand hovered over the coffee pot. Grace was at the front door, her ears erect, her entire body rigid with tension. A deep primal growl rumbled from her chest. Jack's heart pounded. This wasn't over. He reached for his rifle and braced himself. Jack's breath hitched as he slowly approached the window, heart pounding in his chest. The figure was back, standing closer this time, just beyond the edge of the porch. "Damn it," Jack muttered under his breath. He gripped the rifle tighter and turned to Grace. "Stay here." But he knew she wouldn't listen. With deliberate caution, he cracked open the door, stepping onto the porch. The cold morning air bit at his skin, and his boots crunched against the frost-covered wood. "Who's out there?" he called, his voice steady despite the unease twisting in his gut. "This is private property." For a long moment, the figure didn't move. Then it stepped forward, revealing the face of a man in his 40s, partially shadowed by the hood of a tattered jacket. He carried a rope in one hand, and a smirk on his face. "That's my dog." Jack's blood ran cold. "What?" "I've been looking for her," the man said, his voice eerily calm, yet laced with menace. Jack's grip on the rifle tightened. "Your dog," he repeated, incredulous. "She showed up half dead on my doorstep with 2 pups. If she was yours, why the hell did she look like that?" The man shrugged, taking another step forward. "She got out. It happens sometimes, but I'm here to take her back." Jack's stomach churned, the rope in the man's hand, the smirk that never quite reached his eyes, the way Grace had reacted to the shadow in the woods. It all clicked into place. This wasn't just some lost pet. Grace had escaped, and he had come to reclaim her. Jack raised the rifle slightly, its barrel locking squarely onto the man's chest. "You're not taking her anywhere," he said coldly. For the first time, the smirk faltered. The man stopped in his tracks, his expression darkening. "You don't know what you're dealing with, old man," he warned. "That dog's trouble. She's better off with me." Jack didn't flinch. "No," he said, voice like steel. "She's better off with someone who actually gives a damn." The man opened his mouth to reply, but then a sound cut through the cold air. A deep, feral growl. Jack barely had time to turn before Grace stepped forward, her body low, teeth bared. Her fur bristled, her amber eyes locked onto the man like a predator hunting its prey. And then, recognition. Jack saw it in her. The way her growl deepened, the way her body coiled, muscles trembling with restrained fury. This wasn't just a stranger, this was someone she had escaped from, someone who had hurt her pups. The man took an instinctive step back. The rope slipped from his fingers, landing in the snow. For the first time, Jack saw something flicker across his face. Fear. "Grace, get back," Jack ordered, his voice firm. But she didn't move. She was done running. The man swallowed hard, his hands curling into fists. "You've made a mistake, old man," he muttered. "You don't know what that dog is capable of." Jack stepped forward, keeping the rifle raised. "The only mistake here is you thinking you could come back for her," he said coldly. "She's not going anywhere, and neither are her pups." The man's eyes darted between Jack and Grace, weighing his odds. Then, without another word, he turned and disappeared into the woods. Jack didn't lower the rifle until the trees swallowed him whole. The tension in his shoulders ebbed slightly, but not entirely. This wasn't over. Not yet. Inside, Jack bolted the door. Grace remained at the threshold, her body still tense, still on guard. Jack crouched beside her, running a soothing hand over her fur. "He's gone, girl," he murmured. Grace let out a shaky breath. Her body finally relaxed. She turned and nuzzled into Jack's palm, as if seeking comfort. Across the room, Snow and Ash stood by the fire, their tiny yips breaking the silence. Jack scooped them up and placed them beside Grace, watching as she curled protectively around them. She wasn't just their mother, she was their protector, and Jack knew. He was hers. That night, the fire crackled in the hearth, casting long, flickering shadows against the wooden walls. Jack sat in his chair, his rifle within reach, watching the flames dance. Grace lay beside him, her body finally at peace. The man might return. Jack knew that. But he also knew one thing for certain. Grace wasn't running anymore. She had found her home, her family, her courage. And Jack, for the first time in years, had found something worth fighting for. Together they had faced the darkness, and together they would face whatever came next. Overcoming the shadows of Grace's past proved that even in the darkest moments, hope can prevail. Stories like Grace's remind us of the incredible courage animals possess and the profound impact they have on our lives. If this story touched your heart, let it inspire you to take action. Consider adopting, supporting a local shelter, or simply sharing this video to spread awareness. Subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with someone who loves stories of courage and second chances. Together, we can make a difference, one rescue at a time. Thank you for being part of this journey. ****